On this episode of Doing the Most, in collaboration with Clocks and Colors, we're going to make a Gose-inspired mead.
Homemade brews and various how-tos, everything from mead to roast, bake creation, fermentation, inebriation, doing the most.
You may be sitting there wondering, what the hell is a Gose-inspired mead? Well, Gose is actually a style of beer. It's a beer with coriander and sea salt, and it's typically sour and fruited. And yes, I know, that is a lot of things to stack into a mead, and that's why we're gonna make it a session style mead. A while back, Clocks and Colors reached out, and they wanted to do some kind of collaboration with our channel. I'm gonna guess that they probably noticed I'm always wearing my turquoise ring. I'm a ring guy, and they make some pretty cool jewelry, so it seemed like a natural fit. And what's really cool is they make some nautical themed jewelry, and a Gose-inspired mead seemed like a great fit for this collaboration. I wanted to feature a couple of their pieces here because I thought they were super cool. I got their Cape Horn roller because it's a really cool design. It's got kind of an adventure treasure map kind of nautical theme, as well as one of their signature pieces by Peter McKinnon, their Voyager ring, because I like turquoise. You all know that. I encourage you to check out their collection. They've got some stuff for the adventurous spirited person in mind, and if you hit that link in the description, you'll get 20% off your order. Big shout out to Clocks and Colors for their support of the channel. Now, don't consider this to be one of my traditional recipe release videos. This was our first in what is going to be several experiments into the Gose style, because it was kind of hard to find any evidence that anyone has really mastered this style online. I've tried a couple of Gose-inspired commercial varieties, but nothing that really nailed it for my palate. So consider this a lesson on my first foray into developing a recipe. I'm working on a video that will come out in the future on how to develop a recipe for yourself, so keep an eye out for that one. So because Clocks and Colors does this cool nautical themed jewelry, it felt only appropriate to brew something inspired by the sea. And Gose is just really the perfect fit for this collaboration. A Gose is going to be hoppy and fruity and sour, a little bit sweet, and just a touch salty. So there are a lot of things at play to make this recipe a real winner. And what we're really gonna need for that is a honey that stacks up against it. So for this brew, we're using Tupelo honey from Honey Next Door, really solid Tupelo honey. And the thing that I like about Tupelo honey is it's a really big, bold, and interesting varietal of honey that can kind of go up to bat against all those big, intense flavors that are in there. Important to know about this style is it's got just that touch of salt, but it's also got just enough coriander in there for you to notice. Now, it's not enough to overpower the brew. It's not enough to be coriander forward. It's just enough for you to kind of sense that it's there, know that it's there, but maybe not necessarily be able to pick out that coriander is what you're sensing. The ingredients for our Gose-inspired session mead are 8 pounds of honey, 1 ounce of Cascade hops boiled, 1 ounce of crushed coriander, also boiled, and 15 grams of sea salt, also boiled. Water to 5 gallons, and we'll be using Philly sour yeast. In secondary, we'll be adding 1 can of raspberry puree, 2 ounces of Pacific Jade hops 1 week before packaging, 1 ounce of crushed coriander 24 hours before packaging, and also 15 grams of sea salt right in the keg. We'll be using 2 pounds of honey to back sweeten. I got started out by measuring my coriander as well as my bittering hops. And then, as I brought 1 gallon of my brewing water to a boil, I went ahead and measured out my salt. And as soon as that all came to a boil, I dumped it all right in and let it boil for 30 minutes. Now, we're basing this off of beer recipes because that's what's available. So we did coriander in the boil because that's what recipes usually recommend. However, I'm pretty sure that most of it got blown off or obliterated during primary. So as you'll see a little bit later, we're gonna add more coriander near the end of this process to bring that coriander flavor back into it. Also, a lot of recipes have salt being added in the boil. I don't really know that salt in the boil was the right move for this. I guess I would recommend that going forward, but I think you could probably add the salt in secondary, no problem. After 30 minutes, I killed the heat and then started transferring everything into the bucket. I started by putting 1 gallon of cold water in the bottom of my bucket, so that way there would be something for the hot liquid to mix with when it got there. And I strained that hot wort through my hop spider just to get all the solids strained out of there. You could use cheesecloth if you don't have a hop spider. Then I topped it all up with some cold water and moved it to the brew space. Time to add our honey, and as mentioned, we're using Tupelo honey. We got all 8 pounds of our primary honey in there, making sure to microwave it slightly and loosen it up so we can get every last drop out of those containers. And once it all was stirred up and combined, we went ahead and pitched our Philly Sour yeast. Philly Sour is not a typical brewing yeast. It's not even actually Saccharomyces cerevisiae. In fact, it is a different kind of yeast that produces lactic acid during fermentation. So we went ahead and added that right on in. That's me. You're probably wondering how I got into this mess, pitching Philly Sour into a mead. Well, it's a story I'll tell you in just a bit. Our yeast went in, and then we took a gravity reading. Our starting gravity on this was 1.058. Then I sanitized my lid and popped that on. Put an upturned coffee mug on there and let it ride. In my experience, Philly Sour has about a 48-hour lag phase, but I went ahead and front-loaded all 10 grams of my yeast nutrient, which was Fermento. So we used Philly Sour yeast in this because I didn't want to do a kettle sour with a lactobacillus, and I didn't want to add lactic acid to it and secondary or anything like that. I really wanted the biological process to take care of the lactic acid production. However, there's something interesting that happens with Philly Sour yeast in the presence of excess glucose, which honey has. Philly Sour in a beer, which is primarily dominated by maltose, maltotriose, and other sugars, doesn't have like a whole heck of a lot of glucose to work on. So lactic acid production doesn't necessarily go through the roof. Usually you're going to get to 4 or maybe 3.5 on your pH meter. However, it does really well in the presence of glucose, and what I have learned in my now 2 times of using Philly Sour is that in a mead, it goes incredibly sour. Incredibly sour. Sour to the point that it's not really a pleasant flavor. And in this particular brew, it soured so heavily that fermentation basically stopped. So I had to do some buffering. To buffer the pH, I used calcium carbonate. Calcium carbonate is a brewing chalk. It's used to adjust the water profile when you're brewing certain styles of beer. Here, calcium carbonate bonds to lactic acid and creates calcium lactate. Calcium lactate is used in calcium supplements and even antacids. 2 important things. Calcium lactate is not soluble in ethanol, and often it is used as a coagulant in water treatment. In essence, what I was doing is making the mead less acidic and more basic. And we can be fairly confident that most of the calcium lactate that formed in there precipitated out because we were doing all of that in primary, and there was plenty of stuff to grab onto it and pull it down to the bottom of our primary fermenter. But unless you're calcium deficient, there's no real reason to be consuming an excess of calcium in your brews, and so stay tuned to the end of the video where I'm going to explain how you can achieve the same effect without having to use brewing chalk to change the chemistry of your mead. After that was done and we had the pH up to a more manageable level that was going to better accommodate fermentation, I went ahead and pitched EC1118 so we could get fermentation back on track and finish this brew up. It eventually finished up at 1.000 even on my hydrometer. Once primary fermentation had basically finished, I decided to add my can of red raspberry puree, and this got shaken up, opened up, and dumped right on in. I also hit that with a little pectic enzyme to break down the pulp. Then I stirred it well to combine and gave it another week to finish on up. After a week, it had a nice little fruit cap on top, and it was time to get that transferred into our secondary carboy. I used my siphon to rack it off into the carboy. And then we're adding a full 2 ounces of Pacific Jade hops, a nice oceany, sea breezy, and fruity kind of hop, right on in. We're going to give those hops 1 week to do their thing before we transfer it over to our keg. As I was getting ready to move this into the keg, it was clear that the salt content just wasn't enough. So I looked at a few more online recipes, and I realized that kind of the upper limit of salt additions for a Gose-style beer is about 30 grams in a 5-gallon batch. So I went ahead and doubled the amount of salt, and that brought the salinity up just to where I wanted it. Additionally, the coriander wasn't really present either, so I went ahead and put some coriander in some permeable tea bags and left that for 24 hours, effectively doubling the amount of coriander that was in here. Now, doing further research online, I learned that toasting your coriander before crushing it can help release some more of those oils and thus more flavor. So going forward, if I was to brew this again, I would end up doing, instead of 2 ounces total of coriander throughout the whole life cycle of the brew, I would do 1.5 ounces for that 24-hour period prior to packaging, and I would toast it just for a couple of minutes right before I put it into the tea bags. All I had was this very large grain salt, so I went ahead and crushed it up and dissolved it in some hot water. Stir, stir, stir. And then I got out my kitchen scale and weighed out my honey to back sweeten. We are back sweetening here with Tupelo honey, and we'll be using a full 2 pounds of that. I strained in my salt solution because there was a little bit of coriander bits left in there, and then I put in my tea bags full of coriander. And I'm using here some sanitized, unflavored, unwaxed dental floss to hang these tea bags inside the keg so I can retrieve them later. Then in goes my honey, which I microwaved just a little bit to loosen it up. Get our racking cane in our carboy, and then we rack that on top of the honey. And then I purge the headspace in that keg with CO2 a couple of times before leaving it to sit for 24 hours. After 24 hours, I took the top off and pulled my coriander tea bags out. And then I put it under 30 pounds per square inch of CO2 for 48 hours, shaking here and there just to make sure there was plenty of contact between the CO2 and the mead. Through buffering, I was able to get the pH up to around 3.5. Getting the pH up to around 3.5 and really hitting it with a heavy dose of back sweetening honey and amplifying that salt profile really helped nail the salt, sweet, sour profile of this Gose-style mead. Now, if I was going to do this again, I would definitely still use 1 ounce of Cascade hops boiled. I would also go ahead and throw in the 30 grams of sea salt in the boil. I would mix that up with 8 pounds of honey, top it up to 5 gallons, and pitch Philly sour yeast right in the kettle when it was at yeast pitching temperature. I would clamp the lid down and let that ferment for a few days, checking the pH every day until it got to around 4 to 3.5 on the pH meter. At that point, it would be properly soured. And then I would bring that whole thing up to a boil, kill the heat, cover it, and let it come back down to room temperature before transferring it into a carboy and pitching a fresh pack of champagne yeast. In secondary, I would still add 1 can of raspberry puree and 2 ounces of Pacific Jade hops 1 week before packaging, but this time around I would add 1.5 ounces of crushed toasted coriander 24 hours before packaging, as well as that 2 pounds of honey to back sweeten. Doing it this way would allow us to achieve the proper souring on this session mead without having to add any water chemistry amendments to change the pH of the must. So, Philly sour yeast to kettle sour, pasteurize, and then a champagne yeast to finish it off. And because this thing was so wildly experimental and went through a lot of different turmoil, I decided it was only right that I not be the only person to do the taste test. So I brought over David for a second opinion. What we're tasting here is a Gose-inspired mead. Have you ever had a Gose?
I have not.
Okay, so I kind of don't want to tell you anything about it, and we'll just get your perception on it.
Okay.
Cheers.
All right. It's not bad, but it's absolutely not what I thought it was going to taste like by smelling it.
Yeah. So a Gose usually is a lighter beer that's been soured and fruited and has coriander and hops.
It's the coriander. That's what's kind of like weirded my palate out just a little bit, I think.
It's got a little bit of salt in there.
I mean, it tastes salty, but it's not like the ocean.
I likened it to a little bit like a Powerade. How it's got that sweet, sour salt,
Yeah, okay.
kind of like sports drink kind of vibe to it.
That makes sense.
Yeah. So tell me about your tasting notes. Walk me through what's on your palate.
I mean, I can taste the coriander. It's a little salty, but it's nice. You're right. I mean, it does kind of taste like a Powerade in that sense. I think the sour level's really good. Never been a huge fan of like super sour beers. I would drink this.
I sip it, and as I pull it down, it is very sour and tart. There's a little bit of that fruit in there. It's raspberry is what it was fruited with. And
that
so you
makes
can
sense.
get some of those like cool, crisp berry notes.
Yeah.
And as it kind of like washes down into your exhale, all that sweetness comes forward. And as soon as the sweetness dissipates, salt.
Yeah.
Is that kind of where you're at with it?
I mean, I agree with that 100%.
I think the hops level on it's nice. It's not too bitter. It's got a little bit of hops florals, but the hops aren't beating you over the head with it. And I think that the honey actually shines in here.
It does. I mean, it's behind the salt for sure.
Yeah.
I mean, and like I said, I mean, it's salty, which is kind of just weird for me. It kind of reminds me of pickle beer. Or like this pickle flavored beer stuff that people are doing.
Interesting.
It kind of, I mean, it doesn't taste like pickles, but it's similar in the like sense that it's like.
You've got me thinking about Koolickles.
Okay.
Pickles soaked in Kool-Aid.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's similar to that.
Little briny.
Yeah.
Little brackish.
I mean, you don't get like the vinegary effect, but yeah, it's kind of like the.
It's refreshing.
Pickle beer.
I think it's refreshing. It's the type of thing where I think 2 would be my limit.
Yeah, I think so.
I don't think I'd sit all day just pounding Gose-meads, but I think you're right that the salt character and the coriander character, I think, are there where you need them to notice them. And if either of those was lessened any, you wouldn't pick up on that.
Right.
And I think they need to be there enough that you can notice them.
When I think if you didn't have the coriander in there, if you just omitted it, it would kind of just taste like Powerade. Like salty Powerade.
But you get just that touch of like lemony, spicy, almost roasty, nutty kind of coriander character, which is interesting.
Yeah. I mean, I like it. I think it's a success for sure.
Again, thanks to Clocks and Colors, this I think is quite lovely.
Skull.
Skull.